You found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on this.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. When last we left, Pete Greer had not just gone full crocoduck, but turbo crocoduck. Let's see what he has next for us.
Chimpanzees, what do they produce? Well, they produce other chimpanzees. We're supposed to have a common ancestor with that thing, according to evolution.
Yes, they're more genetically similar to humans than tigers are to lions, despite the fact that most creationists argue that lions and tigers share common ancestry. And they're even in the same genus, Panthera.
So bacteria are some of the simplest known life on the earth. That's what some scientists say became the first living organism.
Bacteria may well be the simplest form of life that you can find on Earth today, but they are probably much more complex than the simplest form of life possible. Further, I don't know of anyone in origin of life research who thinks that they represent the likely form of the first life on Earth. Remember, Earth life has been around for somewhere around 4 billion years, and bacteria, if anything, evolved more quickly than eukaryotes, given their rapid reproduction. So bacteria have done a lot of evolving since the origin of life.
How did it become alive and all those other questions? They can't answer it.
Abiogenesis is very much an open subject, and I am not one well versed in it. And I'm lucky if I can correctly identify a benzene ring. But here's the thing. The fact that there still is active research in the field doesn't mean that the thing being researched isn't real or didn't happen. Nor does it mean that our only explanation is miracles. Despite what some religiously motivated outsiders to the origin of life research might tell you, the field is progressing, and researchers in it are not exactly despairing of potential mechanisms for going from abiotic chemistry to life.
But they say that became alive. Darwin thought it was a very simple thing.
What bacteria? The origin of life? This isn't a science point. This is a basic use of pronouns thing. If your antecedent isn't clear, then you shouldn't use a pronoun.
If he knew how complex it was, he may have never gone where he went, but he didn't know that. He thought it was very simple. So he said that we started off there, and through many different changes over time, it became a man.
Darwin never really went into the origin of life in much detail, although yes, he did think that cells were simpler than we now know them to be. But evolution predicts that complexity should arise through time, not so much because complexity is favorable, but because when you start with minimal complexity, as is likely the case for the first life, there's really only one way to go. But again, we're kind of conflating the origin of life with the evolution of subsequent life. Nothing about the complexity of bacteria precludes the evolution of humans. I'm not even sure what the argument is.
Okay, so we've studied bacteria because we want to see them become something else, because that would kind of prove evolution.
No, it absolutely would not. It would disconfirm one of the major aspects of evolution, monophyly. If bacteria ever evolved into something that wasn't bacteria, that would mean that they left behind their ancestry, something which is logically impossible. In evolution, new groups arise within old groups, so you can get new varieties of bacteria, but you can't get them to become not bacteria. Similarly, in organisms you're probably more familiar with, when mammals evolved into primates, they didn't stop being mammals, and when primates evolved into monkeys, they didn't stop being primates, and when monkeys evolved into apes, they didn't stop being monkeys. And when apes evolved into humans, they stayed mammalian, primate, monkey, apes. It's like a branching tree. No branch can ever grow so much that it is no longer connected to the trunk. But it can grow new branches. But again, those branches are still connected to the trunk.
So Linsky, this is a famous experiment where he studied 58,000 generations of E. coli bacteria. He bottled evolution. That's what it says. He bottled evolution. This is what he came up with. 12 replicate populations. Well, what's a replicate population? A replicate population of dogs would be a collie, a German shepherd, whatever the other kind of dog is your favorite, fill it in. So he found E. coli bacteria that looked a little bit different from these different ones, just like we all look a little bit different.
No, Linsky didn't find 12 different populations. He explicitly founded 12 populations that were clones of each other. This is all over the literature that he has published on the long-term experiment. Differences between the populations are the direct result of evolution within each lineage, not initial differences. I'll just read this quick bit of introduction from Linsky et al. 1991, a published paper some 3 or so years after the start of the experiment, and that is linked in the description. It's from the American Naturalist, Volume 138, Number 6, and I found it on the University of Chicago website. Quote, "In this first article, we examine experimentally the process of adaptation and divergence in the simplest possible case. Replicated populations that are founded from a common ancestral clone and then propagated in parallel in a well-defined environment." So the experiment is already mischaracterized at the outset. This does not bode well.
He found some that look a little bit different, so he called them 12 replicate populations and called it evolution.
Nope, he got 12 identical populations and then watched them evolve. I mean, it's right in the paper I cited. This is just wrong. I don't know enough about Pete here to say if he's being ignorant or dishonest, but either way, this is not acceptable from someone who's trying to critique basically all of life science at the very least. In order to critique an idea, you have to know what the idea is. You can't critique Christianity by pointing out that there's no evidence for a hollow earth, simply because that isn't really something that Christians as a whole believe or argue for. Similarly, if you're going to critique an experiment that shows evolution, you can't just pretend that the experiment wasn't what it was.
He saw natural selection and adaptation. We see that, that's true.
He also saw an entire new metabolic pathway evolve, causing some of his populations to no longer meet the standard definition for Escherichia coli. But even if he didn't, adaptation and natural selection are themselves evolution. Evolution is a change in allele frequency in a population over time at a minimum. And let's not forget that this experiment wasn't done to prove evolution. It started in 1988. We were already about 60 years past the need to prove the basics of evolution as we now understand it. Evolution was already the only theory of biodiversity and biological change over time that was in the running. There was no need to try to prove it in 1988. The experiment was meant to demonstrate various mechanisms and elucidate various points within evolutionary biology, such as the importance of historical contingency.
That's scientific. We observe it happening. He never saw the bacteria become anything else, and it didn't even turn into a different type of bacteria.
Well, I repeat myself, but evolution precludes E. coli from becoming something that isn't bacteria. But yes, in fact, the strains called CIT+ are in fact a different kind of bacterium. One of the key ways that E. coli are diagnosed as such is that they are incapable of digesting citrate in an aerobic environment. The CIT+ strains, through a series of mutations, now have evolved the ability to do just that, meaning that they no longer meet the definition of E. coli. So far, the only thing Pete has gotten right about this experiment is that it was started by Lenski and his team, and that it involved 12 strains.
It was still E. coli. They still named them all E. coli. So
if we started calling some of them Fred, would that mean that Mr. Greer here would say that this experiment now shows evolution? Somehow I doubt it, but the fact is that some strains no longer meet the classical definition of E. coli, and if they were found in the wild, they would get a new name.
really, I should be able to just stop there, but I can't. Okay, let's keep going.
What? He should be able to stop after getting every relevant detail of the Lenski long-term E. coli experiment wrong? No, he shouldn't. He should have to go back and get it right, but that's not going to happen.
So here's another real simple thing. We're told that fossils are millions and millions and millions of years old. So according to evolution, which means change, evolution means change, we should see some huge differences, right? Well, there's the turtles, the fossil and the real turtle. We should see minor differences. Adaptation does occur.
But what about animals like Papochelys, Eorhynchochelys, or Odontochelys? These are exactly what we'd expect to see of proto-turtles. Seems like quite a bit of evolution. But I'm sure when you cherry-pick fossils, you can find some that you don't need to bother to make a citation for, that look a whole lot like modern animals. But bring in the whole data field, and suddenly a very different picture is established.
And then we see wolf spiders. They look like the ones we have today.
Okay, but what about Adarcopus? You know, the spider that still has a tail like a whip scorpion? You know, the kind of thing you'd expect if our ideas about the evolution of arachnids are correct, and that does show considerable evidence for the morphological evolution of spiders.
And then we see starfish. Yep, still look the same.
Okay, but what about Tenno imbricata, a bilateral echinoderm? You know, the kind of thing you'd expect to see if our ideas about evolution of sea stars are correct, and that does show considerable evidence for the morphological evolution of echinoderms?
Bats, 50 million years ago, and then today, yep, pretty much the same.
Okay, but what about Onchonycteris, a primitive bat with no adaptations for echolocation, and that still has claws on all of its wing digits? You know, the kind of thing you'd expect to see if our ideas about evolution of chiropterans are correct. And that does show considerable evidence for the morphological evolution of chiropterans.
Crabs, yeah, pretty much the same.
I don't even know where to start with this one. There are at least 5 independent lineages of crustacean that have all evolved into crabs or rather crab-like forms. Each has their own independent fossil lineage. Just look into, quote, carcinization.
Shrimp.
So shrimp are members of the family Caridae, and while the origins of the group are not well preserved, we have huge numbers of species that look very little like modern shrimp you'll find at the market. Organisms like Antrimpos, with its uniformly wide pleopods and weirdly long legs.
Dragonflies.
What about Meganeura, a late Carboniferous odonate that is neither a dragonfly nor a damselfly, but still retains primitive features like obvious cerci? You know, the kind of thing you'd expect to see if our ideas about the evolution of dragonflies were correct, and that does show considerable evidence for morphological evolution of dragonflies.
Horseshoe crabs.
What about Lunataspis, a late Ordovician xiphosuran that doesn't have the division of segments into 3 tagmata, the cephalon, abdomen, and telson. Instead of having a cephalon, non-tagmatized abdominal segments, and a telson. You know, the kind of thing we'd expect to see if our ideas about the evolution of the horseshoe crab are correct, and that does show considerable evidence for the morphological evolution of the horseshoe crab.
I've read in some books that they say horseshoe crabs could be 1 to 2 billion years old.
Bullshit. Okay, I'm pretty confident he's just lying. Animals didn't evolve until about 800 million years ago, and horseshoe crabs sure as are animals. The oldest member known of the order Xiphosaura, the order to which horseshoe crabs belong, is from the late Carboniferous, while the oldest Limulids, which is the family to which the modern horseshoe crab belong, is from the early Carboniferous. I will lay it on the line that he did not read that in any book. He's making it up.
Some scientists believe that, not all. Okay?
I bet he can't fucking name one that think that the god horseshoe crab are 2 billion years old. What the hell would they have eaten? They eat sedentary animals and decaying animals and plants. You know, things that didn't exist 2 billion years ago.
But this is one of the first, things that could move about and so forth. And so there's 1 to 2 billion years of change for you.
Not even close. The first things that could move about on their own were things like Dickinsonia, which isn't even a true bilaterian, never mind an actual chelicerate arthropod, something that wouldn't even begin to evolve until the later Cambrian, as opposed to the Ediacaran, where we find Dickinsonia. And of course, as stated, the fossil record for Xiphosaura goes only back to the Carboniferous. That means we have to get through the Ediacaran, the Cambrian, the Devonian, and the Silurian in order to just get to the first things we might call horseshoe crabs, which were not even modern horseshoe crabs. That's tens of millions of years of stuff moving about. Pete Greer is just making this up, or he's getting it from some bullshit artist who he can't be bothered to fact check. Both lying and sloth are sins, Pete.
There's the seahorse, fossil in today.
So I did a video about this already with Jackson Wheat. Here's a link to it in the upper right hand corner of the video. But to sum it up, seahorses evolved so recently that we still have all the transitional forms leading up to them today, in the form of other members of their family, Cygnathidae, namely the pipefish, sea dragons, etc. Fun times. Also, since creationists tend to put the kind at the family level, then the seahorse evolved from non-seahorse pipefish-like ancestors in the creation model too. Way to be internally consistent, creationists.
This one has a story because they looked at that and they saw those big fins on that fossil, and they said, well, it lived in the warm, shallow ocean, and it moved those fins and it crawled up on land and learned how to breathe air, and it became an amphibian, okay?
Wrong on all counts. Most fossil coelacanths are freshwater, not saltwater fish. They are not particularly close to the ancestors of all tetrapods. That's the stegocephalians. And we don't know if they could breathe air or not, although it's possible.
Well, in the 1950s, I believe, somebody went to a market in Indonesia and saw coelacanths for sale in the fish market.
Yeah, so what? Although I should note that the modern coelacanth, Latimeria, is unknown in the fossil record. We only have distant relations.
And they said, well, where'd you get that? And they said, well, everybody here gets it. We just go out there and we put our nest down and we get them. They said, show us where it is. So they did. They took them out there and we saw real live coelacanths still swimming around in the very deep part of the ocean, by the way, and using their fins for what fish use their fins for.
Again, yes. And hey, want to know why this deep water marine lineage doesn't really have much of a fossil record? Oh, it's because deep water marine animals don't last that long and have a poor fossil record overall.
It's part of a class of fish called the lobe-finned fishes.
Yep, or to be a bit more technical, Sarcopterygian. And along with the coelacanth, it also includes the South American and African lungfish and tetrapods, who are stegocephalians, along with forms like Eusthenopteron.
So they took that lobe-finned fish, they found the fossil, they made a story up on it.
Nope. The first coelacanth was described and named by Louis Agassiz in 1839. The group had been known from fossils for more than a century. They didn't need to go find a fossil now that they had living examples.
And they tell you that you just don't know what's going on if you don't believe their story.
What story? That coelacanths are found in the fossil record? I mean, they are. We've known that for almost 200 years now.
So we'll never see the birdfish.
Well, birds are already fish, but they're not hybrids between ray-finned and lobe-finned fish. They're highly derived lobe-finned fish. So, no, you won't see anything like that absurd straw man he flashed up on his TV.
So where is the evolution in all of that? We see natural selection and adaptation, but we don't see anything changing into something else.
What is meant by something else? Because we see speciation happen, both in the lab and in the wild. So unless Pete here is going to be way more specific about what we should see but don't if evolution be true, then he's just taking a long time to say nothing.
This is an interesting quote. Everybody knows that organisms get better as they evolve. They get more advanced, more modern, and less primitive. And everybody knows that organisms get more complex as they evolve. The only trouble with what everybody knows is that there is no evidence that it is true.
Oh, look, a good old-fashioned quote mine. So if Pete is using this honestly, then it means that Dan McShay is implying that there is some fundamental problem with evolution as an explanation for the origin of biodiversity. Well, let's read the next two paragraphs, shall we? Quote, "At one level, of course, it must be true. We really are more complex than the first cell, and we're not alone. Anyone can see that the first organism on this planet was simpler than the modern reptile or beetle or whatever," says McShay. But that proves very little. The first organism was almost certainly the simplest organism, which means that in terms of complexity, there was initially no place for life to go but up. The interesting question is what happened later. Did natural selection drive organisms onward and steadily upwards towards ever greater complexity because being more complex improves their chances of survival? Researchers have always assumed the answer was yes. But lately, McShay and a few other researchers have been trying to test that unshakable assumption with real data. And the data tell a different story. Evolution does not necessarily drive life towards greater complexity. As organisms evolve, they are just as likely to shed complexity as to gain it, at least insofar as biologists can measure it." End quote. Huh. Weird how that isn't what the article is talking about. It's about whether there is an overall tendency to increase complexity which is intrinsic to evolution once you're past the minimum in complexity. McShay is arguing that no, there is not, and I agree with him.
So why are we thinking that? Or why are we teaching that?
We're not teaching that evolution has an ever-present trend towards complexity. But again, when you start at the minimum, you're going to trend up for a while, of necessity, since that's the only way to go.
This is not a creationist. This is an evolutionary biologist from the University of Michigan.
Whom Pete has quote-mined and who wouldn't agree with Mr. Greer on basically any of this talk so far.
So evolution is all about illusion. You teach these things that you have absolutely no observational evidence to prove that one thing became another, and you teach it as a fact, and you call people, kind of not up with the times if they don't believe that.
No evidence of something evolving into other things, eh? I think it's time for the transitional species slideshow. Enjoy. After this, he preaches a bit about the Bible. This channel isn't for that, so we're skipping it. Basically, all he said was that the Mosaic Law helped with sanitation and prevented inbreeding. Maybe it did. If so, then good for the ancient Hebrews. If it didn't, then whatever.
Geologic features show evidence of a worldwide flood and rapid deposition of geologic layers.
Boy, do they ever not, but let's see what he has to say for himself. But before he really goes into this, he complains about people who think the flood was real but local. I don't care, he can have whatever catfight he wants with local flood believers. But I'll say this, we do know that there was no global flood, but we also do know that there were local floods, so maybe he should adopt the local flood idea so he can be only maybe wrong instead of definitely wrong.
We should find billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth if there was a worldwide flood.
Specifically, we should find billions of dead things sorted hydrologically and not by taxonomy or ecology in global turbidite depositions. Instead, we find quadrillions of dead things, far more than could possibly have existed at once, in rock layers laid down in countless non-catastrophic ways. In the upper left, you'll see a link to an excellent video about just how many fossils you can find in just one part of the United States and why it precludes the flood model. It's by Joel Duff, who runs an excellent and criminally underviewed YouTube channel. Go check him out.
Do we? Yes, we do. We see huge geological layers laid down across most of our United States. This one, the Tapete Sandstone that you can see in the Grand Canyon.
But it's not global. You'd need a globally correlated turbidite deposition event to show a worldwide flood. Further, we have trace fossils in the Tapete Sandstone, such as burrows and trackways, but characteristically, flood deposits destroy trace fossils. So we know for a fact that Tapetes was not laid down by a flood. Instead, it was a marine transgression, meaning that the sea levels were high for a sustained period, and so what would be low elevation land at the current sea level were instead shallow oceans. But this is not a high energy event like a flood.
That didn't get laid down by a local flood. So I observed these things on some of my travels. I took a picture of the Badlands in South Dakota. Notice, the smooth transition between one layer and another.
Excuse me, the did you just say?
What are you talking about? Those pictures showed sharp boundaries between layers with virtually no transition in the first picture, and then sharp cliffs aligned with sediment layers in the next. That's not smooth transition. What is even happening right now? He's just lying to us with the evidence on screen.
This is the Grand Canyon. Once again, it's kind of smooth in between the layers.
Well, first it's not, but I also find it amusing that some creationists point out how abrupt the contact can be between strata as evidence of a flood. And here this guy is pretending the layers always have smooth transitions between them, as if that would help his case. I guess the layers are both too smooth and too abrupt. Only the magical flood that can deposit literally anything, regardless of physics or chemistry, can explain this.
And then this is from the Petrified National Forest. Once again, you see these smooth layers.
Is he maybe not talking about the transition between strata? Maybe he's just talking about how horizontal they are? I'm honestly just trying to figure out what Pete means in a way that isn't just nonsense.
Well, we didn't see those form, so they say it happened over millions of years, and they come up with their story, how it happened and everything. But then we had this flood in Washington that formed this canyon in 6 days.
Yeah, a canyon formed in a few hours through unconsolidated ash that had no switchbacks and basically no tributaries or other sharp turns like the Grand Canyon. In other words, it's only like the Grand Canyon in that they are both erosional features. Tell you what, Pete, get me a rapidly formed canyon that formed in less than a day and also has switchbacks that you didn't just set up yourself. I'll wait.
Notice the layers. It was formed rapidly by moving water and mud slurry.
Notice the layers! Yeah, everyone knows that laminae and tuff can be deposited rapidly in high volume. Because, volcanoes release a lot of material when they go boom. Cool, but is the Grand Canyon carved through tuff? Oh wait, it's not. Weird, it's almost like this whole thing is irrelevant.
Well, Mount St. Helens blew its top, and it left behind smooth layers. It left behind a canyon 1/40th the size of the Grand Canyon.
No.
The layers fell as ash, the muddy water carved the canyon. Does this guy need like baby's first geology book to help him figure out the most basic things about geology? The kind of stuff you normally cover when you're like 10 in school earth science class?
And the layers are there. just by rapidly moving mud and water. So I got to go there on that trip I took with Rick Oliver in 2010. That was kind of a bucket list thing that I wanted to see Spirit Lake especially. There's 400,000 logs still floating there in 2010.
Neat.
It started with 1 million. They came off that hillside right over my left shoulder there. The water went up there, washed 1 million logs down to that lake. Well, they've been sinking ever since. And they went down, and we have these things called polystrate fossils. They're tree trunks that go up through many geological layers.
No, those will not form polystrate fossils, assuming they do fossilize. They will form fossils stretching across a few laminae, which are smaller layers within a stratum. They will not stretch to a new stratum, because Spirit Lake is a single depositional environment. So, when that eventually becomes lithified, it will all be the same stratum, and that stratum will contain many laminae, some of which will be tufaceous because of the eruption.
And we see this forming in the bottom of Spirit Lake, where every year, as the silt comes in and forms another layer, it's burying the logs that first sank. And the ones that sank later, they're being buried a little bit higher. So we're seeing these polystrate fossils actually form, and it's only been 41 years since Mount St. Helens, I think. And all this we see happening already, not over millions of years.
Except, again, you're not seeing it happen. And there are no polystrate fossils in the fossil record in the first place. So even if we were seeing it happen, there would be nothing to compare it to.
Bent sedimentary rock. So this was sedimentary rock, and in order for it to bend and not break, it had to be soft when that layer pushed down and folded it.
Incorrect. It needed to be under pressure and be hot, which fortunately for us is kind of what the interior of the Earth is like. Further, it is generally cracked, but creationists just like to lie about it. Further, if it were still unlithified when it bent, which does happen, the boundary between layers would be blurred and there would be a milky coloration there, as the cementing agents that are lithifying the rocks in question are squeezed into there. We don't see that. Even further, we have plastically deformed animal remains in some of these bent layers. If a dinosaur skull can bend with the sediment it's found in, then it sure wasn't in soft sediment, because that wouldn't have bent the skull. Instead, it bent as a hard fossil within the hard stone.
It didn't break, it didn't crumble, it just bent. There's a 90-degree turn right there, and you can see it's not bent, or, it's just it is bent, it's not fractured.
I actually can't see that because of low resolution.
Here's one that has the spiritual implication. That we know that God said in Genesis 3:18, thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee. Okay, that was part of the curse, after sin. But we find this in the fossil record way, way, way before humans were allegedly on the earth, according to evolution.
Well, according to the fossil record, which doesn't contain a whiff of even primates, when we get our first thorns. I guess that sucks for a literal interpretation of Genesis, but that's not a reason to reject reality. It's a reason to reject either Genesis or that interpretation of it. Sorry, when anything and reality conflict, reality wins.
So, if thorns formed before humans, but God said that thorns weren't made until after Adam and Eve's sin, one of those two things is wrong.
Yeah, it's one that has no science backing it up, and science does back up ancient thorns before humans. Pointing out that your favorite interpretation of your favorite book contradicts that is not a point against science. It means literally nothing about what is true in reality.
It's in a flood layer. The flood came after Adam and Eve.
It might be in a flood layer. Lots of fossils are, but not all of them, or even most of them. But also, there has been no evidence provided that Adam and Eve were real people, and even if they were, they didn't predate thorns.
So if you believe the biblical view, you believe that that's not millions of years old, that it happened after Adam and Eve.
That's not the biblical view. It's a biblical view. And it's not even the majority view among people who have Genesis in their scriptures, that being Christians and Jews.
There's evidence from many cultures all over the world that dinosaurs and humans have coexisted in the not very distant past. Well, we have a problem. Some Christians say, I don't believe there's dinosaurs. It's not in the King James Bible. I don't see that word. So God put those bones there to test my faith.
That's dumb. The Bible also doesn't mention house cats. I feel like very few Christians would then deny the existence of house cats for that reason. In fact, some Christian groups have a long tradition of church cats, I've met a few church cats. To be fair, I don't think Pete thinks this is a good argument.
Well, there's a very simple solution to that. You don't find the word dinosaur in the Bible because it wasn't invented until 1841. King James Bible translated in 1611. You couldn't have had it in there. We have dragon, behemoth, leviathan, which I believe were all some form or another of dinosaur, but you don't have the actual word dinosaur. In the 1828 dictionary, you have computer, locomotive, and rocket, but you don't have the word dinosaur. It wasn't invented yet.
It's not that the word for rocket or dinosaur weren't invented. It's that those people had no word for those things because they didn't know what they were.
So we have dinosaur tracks.
We do, and that alone is enough to negate any possibility that all the strata with dinosaurs are flood layers.
We have mountains of dinosaur bones, disarticulated like they were in this big flood and got washed up in a whirlpool that just pulled them apart.
Yeah, you see, the thing is, floods don't tend to dismember big animals. However, if the animals die, they start to rot, and then if a flood comes, you can get disarticulated fossil remains in a flood deposit, where the bones are graded by size. This actually does happen, but it can't have been the result of a single event. Sorry.
And then it dumped them all on these big mounds. This one's in China. We have another one like that in Dinosaur National Monument here in the United States.
Yep, floods happen and they can deposit bones. No one has ever argued against this to my knowledge. But you know what? With this crazy talk about, oh, hey, if any floods exist, then they must have all just been the global flood of Noah. I'm going to cut it off for now. I will catch you guys in episode 3. I really hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, make sure you hit like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. Put in the comments what you liked, or if you didn't like it, tell me what you think I should do better. Either way, I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. I just want to take a moment to thank all my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Tovand, Denny5252, Ian Chen, John Ackerman, Chris Love, Landon Knoll, Sphincter of Doom, Star Runner, and Patrick Dennis. It's because of my channel members and patrons that this channel can keep on going at the blistering pace of 2 to 3 and almost always 3 uploads per week. And because I do run this channel at a slight loss, it is very important that anyone who can afford to and really likes my content, please do consider joining the Patreon or joining the channel with the link below. Patreon link is in the description. On Patreon, you can join at a 10% discount if you join for an annual subscription. And if for some reason you can't afford it, or an annual or monthly pledge isn't for you, there are always other ways to help out the channel. There's an Amazon wishlist linked in the description. There's also a merch store full of almost everything that Teespring makes.